Hello, today we will be soldering a female XLR connector onto a balanced cable. So here we have a male XLR on the left-hand side and the female XLR on the right-hand side. Notice that the male pins are a little bit smaller than the female ones. Also, pins 1 and 2 are on opposite sides. So if you're soldering a male side, pin 1 will be on the opposite side than it will be on the female. We will always be soldering the ground into pin 1, the hot wire into pin 2, and the cold into pin 3. So here's the soldering iron, the brass we're going to use to clean the tip of it, and the flux. Here are the 4 pieces of the female XLR connector. Here is the razor blade and the wire strippers. These are the wire cutters and a small flathead screwdriver. And here is the needle nose pliers. We have the spool of solder, and we have the vise. Here I am putting the rubber backing onto the cable. And you always want to do this first, especially if you have a connector on the other side of the cable, because if you forget this and you solder that side on, you'll have no choice but to either cut it off or desolder it to put that rubber back on. I also put on the plastic piece. That will go over the pins after we solder the wires on there. The first thing we need to do to prepare the cable is to cut about 3/4 of an inch of the insulation off the end. We can also cut a little slit in the side to help us remove the insulation from the end of the cable. It's extremely important not to cut too deep where you're cutting out the individual strands of the shield, because you would be degrading the quality of your ground wire. I'm using the small screwdriver as a tool to debraid the shielding from the end of the cable, because we're not just going to cut it off, we're actually going to use it and turn it into the ground wire. So now I'm twisting up that shielding fairly tightly. Now I am going to strip off the insulation from the ends of each of those audio wires. We don't want to strip off all the insulation because it's there for a purpose. Without that insulation, it would be very easy for 2 wires to touch. If that were to happen, signal would short out and we would get either extra noise, phase cancellation, or what have you. We want to make sure not to cut off any of the individual strands of wire with the wire strippers either. So what I always do is start out with the biggest hole first and work my way smaller. So I'll start out with the biggest hole. If that's too big, I move down to the next smallest hole. And if that's too big, I move down to the next smaller one until I get the right one. That way I won't accidentally use too small of a hole and cut off those individual audio wires. Now we're going to do a process called tinning, in which we put a thin coating of solder on each of these wires. It holds a twofold purpose. The main reason is that it combines all those single strands together. Also, it will help it fuse to whatever you're going to solder it to. So I'm going to put a little bit of solder on the tip of my iron, and as you can see, as soon as it hits the heat, it gets molten immediately. I'm applying a thin coating of solder to each of the exposed metal parts of these conductors. After I'm done tinning the 2 audio wires, then I can tin the ground wire too. So I'm going to prepare that one. I can clean the tip of my iron off, and I'm going to add a little bit of flux to the ground wire. And then I'm going to tin that one by adding a thin coating of solder from all the way down at the insulation to the tip of that shielding. Whether you're doing the male side of the XLR or the female, it doesn't matter. They're both done the same way. You're going to fill up each of these pins with some solder. I'm going to apply the heat to the back of the pin, and I'm going to load the solder in from the front, so as the solder touches the hot pin, it will melt inside of it. As soon as I remove the heat from the pin, the solder inside of it will harden immediately. Since I'm able to maneuver the audio wires around a little more freely than the ground wire, I'm going to solder the ground wire in pin 1 first. To make that task a little bit easier for myself, I'm going to make the ground wire just a tad bit shorter than the audio wires. Also notice that I cover up the piece of metal that I'm going to cut with my other hand. I do that so it doesn't fly across the room and hit someone. I'm going to apply the heat to the back of pin 1 until the solder gets molten, and then I'm going to load in the ground wire. Now, it's not going to go all the way down to the bottom of the pin. However, as long as it's in there, the solder is going to fuse around it and harden, so that should hold it in place. Whenever I'm done soldering each wire in, I'm going to use my needle nose pliers and give it a tug to make sure it's not going to pop out. If you solder the red wire into pin 2 on the female side of the cable, then the red wire also must be soldered into pin 2 on the male side of the cable. And if you solder the black wire into pin 2 on the female side of the cable, then the black wire has to be soldered into pin 2 on the male side. So it doesn't matter which one you pick as long as you're consistent on both sides of the cable. We then make one last check to ensure that each of our wires are secured inside of their individual pins, and then we can put the rest of the connector on. So we move that little plastic piece up and put it over the pins we just soldered the wires onto. Then we can slide the metal piece over and screw the rubber backing onto it.